In the summer of 1943, American B-24 Liberators thundered across the skies over Romania, bound for the Ploesti oil fields in what became one of the war's most daring low-level bombing raids. The bombers came in at treetop height, roaring over the countryside at barely 200 feet, straight into the teeth of the most heavily defended target in Europe. Flak rose in black clouds, and German gunners were waiting. More than a year later, on August 9, 1944, First Lieutenant Richard Fellman was piloting his B-24 Liberator on a bombing run over Yugoslavia when his plane was hit head-on by German anti-aircraft fire. The shell tore through the right wing and fire erupted across the fuel tanks. The bomber lurched hard to starboard. Fellman fought the controls for a moment, then keyed the intercom, "Bail out now." He held the plane steady long enough for his crew to drop through the bomb bay. Then he left his seat and followed them into the roaring sky. His parachute snapped open, and he drifted down into a country he did not know, hoping the people below would be friendlier than the gunners who had just shot him out of the air. He landed hard in a tree, tangled in his lines, and before he could even cut himself free, Serbian villagers were climbing up to reach him. They did not hand him over to the Germans. They cut him down, carried him to a farmhouse, and hid him in a hayloft. Over the following weeks and months, the same scene played out again and again across the hills of Yugoslavia. Pilots and gunners from other downed bombers drifted into the same welcoming arms of people who had every reason to turn them away but chose not to. The scattered airmen were moved deeper into the mountains, into villages controlled by a man named Draza Mihailovich. He was a general of the old Yugoslav army, commander of the Chetnik forces, and he had been waging a guerrilla war against the Nazis since the invasion of his country. Mihailovich gave strict orders to his men: protect these Americans with your lives. In the village of Pranjane and dozens of smaller hamlets, the downed airmen began to gather. A young B-24 pilot named Richard Fellman stepped forward as their leader, organizing the men and keeping their spirits alive on goat cheese and hay bread. 1,000 miles away in occupied Belgrade, a Serbian-American OSS captain named George Vujnovic was living a double life with his wife, Mirjana. They had been stranded in Yugoslavia since the invasion, using forged papers and false identities to survive under the noses of the Gestapo. But by January of 1944, the net was closing. The Vujnoviches made a desperate escape by train across Nazi-occupied Europe, through Budapest, Istanbul, and finally to Cairo, where George reported for duty with the Office of Strategic Services. He was soon stationed in Bari, Italy, running operations into the Balkans. From her new home in New York, Mirjana Vujnovic wrote to her husband with news she had heard through Serbian contacts. The letter was brief, but its contents hit George like a physical blow. She said there were American airmen hiding in the hills of Yugoslavia, dozens of them, maybe more, and that they were being sheltered by Mihailovich's Chetniks. She asked him directly, "Are you involved in trying to get them out?" Vujnovic held the letter in his hands, the thin paper carrying a weight he could not ignore. Vujnovic began asking questions around the OSS post in Bari. At first, the answer was always the same. The Americans had no presence in that part of Yugoslavia, no way to verify such reports, and no authorization to launch a rescue into enemy territory. But the stories kept coming. Other OSS agents, including a burly field operative named George Musulin, who had just been pulled out of Chetnik territory, confirmed that Mihailovich was harboring a large number of airmen. Musulin put the count close to 100 men near the Chetnik headquarters at Pranjane. Political winds were shifting against Mihailovich. The British had already ordered all Allied units to withdraw from his forces, and the propaganda machine was painting him as a collaborator. But the truth that Vujnovic heard from the men who had lived alongside the Chetniks, was something else entirely. These people were giving up their last bits of food for stranded American boys, risking torture and death with every act of kindness. And now hundreds of those boys were waiting for someone to come and bring them home. In the spring of 1944, the fate of General Draza Mihailovich and dozens of stranded American airmen was sealed not on a battlefield but at a desk in Cairo. A British Special Operations Executive Officer named James Klugman was secretly a Soviet mole, and he controlled the intelligence reports flowing out of Yugoslavia. Klugman carefully edited and rewrote field dispatches, suppressing any evidence that Mihailovich's Chetniks were fighting the Germans. He promoted false claims that the Chetniks were collaborating with the enemy, while exaggerating the combat record of Tito's communist partisans. His stack of doctored reports, the material anchor of this betrayal, convinced British and American leaders to cut all aid to Mihailovich and shift their full support to Tito. The Allies officially branded the man who had risked everything to protect downed airmen a Nazi collaborator. That same spring, the British ordered the only OSS agent living with the Chetniks, Captain George Mussolini, to leave Yugoslavia immediately. Mussolini had become a friend of Mihailovich and had personally witnessed the general's unwavering dedication to the American flyers. He tried to stall, hoping to bring out more men, but Churchill himself insisted on his removal. In May 1944, a plane landed behind enemy lines to extract Mussolini and 40 of the airmen he had been helping. As the plane lifted off, Mussolini looked back at the mountains of Ravna Gora, knowing he was leaving behind not just a loyal ally, but hundreds of American boys who now had no one left to speak for them. Mihailovich was isolated, branded a traitor by the very powers he had aided, and the stranded airmen were left to wonder if anyone would ever come for them. Months earlier, in March 1944, while the stranded airmen waited in the mountains of Yugoslavia, the OSS launched a mission codenamed Columbia. A young radio man named Arthur Gibellian parachuted into partisan-held territory with 2 experienced agents. Their job was to gather intelligence and establish radio contact with Allied headquarters. Gibellian carried a bulky suitcase radio, his lifeline to the outside world. He set up the transmitter on a wooded hillside and began sending signals to Cairo. But no one was listening. The Cairo post had been told the mission was canceled, and no one told the men on the ground. The radio silence cost them dearly. German direction-finding equipment locked onto Gibellian's transmissions. Within minutes, Messerschmitts and Stuka dive bombers were screaming down on their position. Gibellian slammed the radio off and ran. 3 Americans sprinted uphill through dense forest as machine gun rounds tore through the trees around them. They dropped their heavy gear, including the precious radio, and kept moving. For 5 days and 6 nights, they hid in snowdrifts, eating nothing but what local peasants could spare. They survived, but their mission was finished. Gibellian had learned the hard way that in this war, your allies could be as dangerous as your enemy. By May 1944, George Mussolini was back in Bari, having been forcibly extracted from Chetnik territory on Churchill's direct order. He stepped off the plane in a rage that did not cool. When he heard what the British and even his own OSS colleagues were saying about Mihailovich, that the general was a Nazi collaborator who would sell out American airmen for a reward, Mussolini exploded. He stormed into OSS headquarters and screamed at anyone who would listen. "You think I risked my life for almost a year for nothing?" he shouted. Mussolini had lived with the Chetniks. He had seen them give their last crust of bread to starving Americans. He knew the truth, and the lies made him sick. Vujinovic listened to Mussolini and believed every word. Unlike many in the OSS, Vujinovic understood what communism really was. He had seen it in Yugoslavia before the war. He knew that throwing Allied support behind Tito was not just a betrayal of Mihailovich, but a gift to Stalin. The people in the OSS, he told Mussolini, they hear communist and just think of Russian communists. They do not realize what it really means. Vujinovic was already under fire from pro-communist elements in the OSS who thought he was too friendly to the Chetniks. But he did not care. He had his wife's letter confirming the airmen were there, and now he had Mussolini's eyewitness account. He began planning a rescue, knowing the British would do everything to stop him. Through July 1944, the OSS team made 5 separate attempts to parachute into Pranjani. Every single one was sabotaged by the British. On the first try, the pilot flew to the wrong coordinates. On another, a partisan soldier was sitting in the back of the plane, assigned as the jump master. Mussolini grabbed his sidearm when he saw the red star on the man's cap. "No communist is going to push me and my men out of this plane," he said, and aborted the mission. On the 5th attempt, as Mussolini braced himself in the open door of the C-47, he looked down and saw flashes of heavy weaponry. The British were trying to drop them directly into an active battle. He pushed back from the door, shoved the jump master aside, and screamed at the pilot to abort. That was the last straw. Mussolini marched into Vujinovich's office and demanded an American plane, an American crew, and an American jump master. The 3-man team would consist of Mussolini, Sergeant Mike Rajasic, and radioman Arthur Gibellian. No more British interference. Vujinovich did not hesitate. He picked up the phone and arranged for an all-American team. The men would fly out of Brindisi in an American C-47 with an American pilot who took his orders from the OSS, not from London. If the British wanted to sabotage this rescue, they would have to do it another way. The next attempt would be different. The next attempt would be American all the way. The men in Pranjane had been waiting for months now, with Musulin and his team still missing after 5 failed attempts. The airmen took matters into their own hands. Richard Fellman and Thomas Oliver gathered around a salvaged radio set, its wires patched and exposed. They knew the risk. A single long transmission could bring German fighters down on them. They had no choice left. Oliver had devised an elaborate code using references only his squadron would understand: the nickname of his bomber, the color of a scarf worn by a fellow pilot, the serial numbers of his crew hidden inside map coordinates. He tapped out the message in Morse. 150 Yanks are here, some 6 send workhorses. The workhorse was the C-47. Then he signed off with the code words only the 459th Bomb Group could parse. For 2 days, the radio sat silent. Then on the night of July 31st, a faint signal broke through from Italy. The reply was brief: "Prepare reception for 31st July or first clear night following." The code had worked. The airmen erupted in celebration, but the tension remained. They had to hold out a little longer. On the evening of August 2nd, an American C-47 droned out of the dark sky over Pranjane, its belly carrying 3 OSS men. This time, no British interference. The pilot had the correct coordinates. Along the edges of a clearing below, villagers had set out flare pods, simple metal cans stuffed with oil-soaked rags and wood. When the plane circled, Fellman gave the order, "Light the flares." The pots burst into orange flame, marking the drop zone. Muslin, Rajasic, and Jibilian jumped from only 800 feet, plummeting hard into the mountainside. Muslin smashed through a chicken coop on landing. Rajasic tangled in a tree. Jibilian landed in a cornfield. Within minutes, Chetnik soldiers swarmed them, grabbing the Americans in bear hugs and kisses. Captain George! Captain George!" they shouted, recognizing Musulin from his earlier mission. Later that night, Mihailovich himself came to greet the rescue team. He saluted the young radioman Jibilian, who snapped back a formal salute. The general was a quiet, dignified man, dressed like his troops in threadbare wool. He made no demands, only asked how he could help. The rescue mission now had a secure foothold in enemy territory. The next morning, a huge task began. The only flat area near Pranjane was a narrow plateau of about 700 yards, just barely long enough for a C-47 to land, and surrounded by steep drop-offs and dense forest. The airmen, numbering 250, joined 300 villagers and ox carts. They had no bulldozers, no graders, only their hands, a few axes, and 60 ox carts for hauling. For days they cleared rocks, felled trees, and carried gravel from a nearby streambed to level the field. Men with broken bones and infections worked alongside the able-bodied. Whenever a German reconnaissance plane appeared overhead, someone shouted and everyone sprinted for the woods, leaving the field empty and innocent. Then they crept back and resumed digging, their hands raw and bleeding. The ox carts creaked under loads of soil. The airmen extended the runway by 75 yards, pushing into the trees at the far end. Musulin inspected the work each evening, pacing the length with his boots, testing for soft spots. The strip was rough, bumpy, and barely adequate, but it was their only way home. By August 8th, he judged it ready. Jibilian tapped out the code to Bari. "Ready. Start evacuation tomorrow night at 10 p.m. On August 9th, 4 C-47s arrived. The first plane came in low, its wheels touched down too far along the strip, and the pilot slammed the throttles forward, aborting the landing and pulling back into the night sky. The men in the trees groaned, but the second pilot had been watching. He aimed his wheels at the very edge of the field, dropped down hard, and braked savagely. The plane shuddering to a stop at the far end of the runway. 3 more planes followed, each landing perfectly in the dark. Within an hour, 48 airmen were aboard, and the planes lifted off, barely clearing the treetops. The next morning, 6 more C-47s arrived, escorted by a swarm of P-51 Mustangs and P-38 Lightnings. The fighters dove into the valleys, strafing German positions to keep them away while the cargo planes landed one by one. By midday, nearly all the stranded men were in the air. Operation Halyard continued for months, each flight pulling more men out of the mountains. By December 27th, the last plane lifted from the muddy strip, carrying the OSS team and a final group of airmen. The total rescued, 512 men. Not one life was lost in the landings or takeoffs. The makeshift airstrip built with bare hands and ox carts had performed a miracle. The first planes touched down at Bari on the morning of August 10th. General Nathan Twining of the 15th Air Force stood on the tarmac with George Vujnovich, both men watching the C-47s roll to a stop. The rescued airmen climbed out, gaunt and bearded, many of them shoeless after giving their boots to Serbian villagers. Twining shook their hands and congratulated them, but his next words carried a sharp edge. "Do not talk to anyone about this," he told them. "Do not reveal even the most insignificant information about your experience." The war was still on, he said, and any leak could jeopardize future evacuations. The men understood the need for operational security, but they soon realized the gag order had a second purpose. The rescue had depended entirely on Draza Mihailovich and his Chetnik fighters, the same man the Allies had officially branded a Nazi collaborator. If the world learned that Mihailovich had saved 500 American lives while being denounced as a traitor, the political embarrassment would be enormous. So the story stayed buried. No press releases, no newsreels. The rescued men returned to their bases, were debriefed in private and told to move on. Most of them obeyed, but they never forgot what they owed to the man the Allies had abandoned. 2 years later, in March of 1946, the news reached America that Mihailovich had been captured by Tito's partisans. The charges were predictable: treason and collaboration with the enemy. A show trial began in Belgrade that June, staged in a floodlit auditorium packed with 1,000 loyal spectators. Tito refused to allow any of the rescued American airmen to testify on Mihailovich's behalf. The trial lasted barely a month. Among the rescued airmen, one B-24 gunner who had spent weeks hidden by the Chetniks followed the news with growing dread. The verdict was never in doubt. On the morning of July 17, 1946, Draza Mihailovich faced a firing squad. His last words to the world were these: "I strove for much, I undertook much, but the gales of the world have carried away both me and my work." He was 50 years old, his body was lowered into an unmarked grave, and Tito's regime declared the matter closed. In America, the airmen who had lived under his protection wept when they heard the news. Tony Orsini broke down at his kitchen table. Richard Fellman pounded his fist in frustration. They had tried to save him. They had formed a committee, chartered a plane to Washington, and begged the State Department to intervene. None of it mattered. 2 years after Mihailovich was executed, President Harry Truman signed a document that the public would not see for nearly 2 decades. He awarded Draza Mihailovich the Legion of Merit, the highest American decoration available to a foreign national, for his service in rescuing more than 500 American airmen. The citation praised Mihailovich for organizing resistance forces and contributing materially to the Allied victory, but the State Department objected to any publicity. They feared it would damage relations with Tito's Yugoslavia, so the medal was sealed in a drawer in Washington, classified as secret and nearly forgotten. In May of 2005, the surviving veterans returned to Serbia. George Vujnovich, Arthur Jibilian, and a handful of others presented the long-hidden Legion of Merit to Gordana Mihailovich, the general's daughter. She kissed the medal, held it close, and whispered to a photograph of her father. The old men wept, finally able to honor the man who had saved them. The story of the Forgotten 500 does not end with medals or ceremonies. It ends with a simple truth about human gratitude. 512 men came home because a foreign general and his ragged army chose to protect them, even when it cost them everything. Those men raised families, built careers, and lived out their years in freedom, never forgetting whose courage had made that possible. Some of them returned to visit Serbian villages long after the war and were greeted with embraces from people who remembered the young Americans they had hidden in their haylofts. That memory, passed from one generation to the next, outlasted the political betrayals that tried to bury it. George Muselin, disillusioned by the betrayal, lived quietly in Virginia until his death in 1987. Mike McCool became a lawyer and joined the 2005 delegation to Serbia. If you have your own family stories from the Second World War, stories of survival or rescue that have been passed down through the years, we would be grateful to hear them. Share them in the comments below, and we will read every one. Thank you for listening to this history of Operation Halyard and the remarkable men who lived it. If you found this story worth your time, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It helps us continue telling the stories that deserve to be remembered.